Jake pulled into the cracked driveway, his old sedan rumbling to a stop. The house loomed before him, a modest two-story with peeling gray paint and dark windows like hollow eyes. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, letting out a shaky breath. This was it, his fresh start. But something about the house unsettled him, though he couldn't place why. He shook the thought away. Rent this low was a godsend. Beggars couldn't be choosers. Jake was the kind of guy who always played it safe, which made his current situation ironic. A few months ago, his carefully constructed life unraveled. His girlfriend of 3 years left him, his job downsized, and he had no choice but to leave his apartment. But Jake was also stubborn. He refused to move back in with his parents or rely on anyone else. That's why he jumped at the listing. Spacious 2-bedroom home, cheap rent, immediate availability. But when he first called the landlord, something had felt off. The man spoke in a rushed, almost irritated tone, as if he didn't want to waste time explaining details. But the rent was irresistible, and Jake needed a win. The house didn't look like much, but then again, neither did he. Jake was tall and lanky, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a wardrobe of faded hoodies and jeans. He carried an air of quiet determination, though, like someone who had endured one too many setbacks, but wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed his backpack and stepped out of the car. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn, but there was a stillness in the air that felt unnatural, as if the house were holding its breath. Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but then he brushed it off and approached the front door. The landlord, a wiry man with thinning hair and darting eyes, had been waiting on the porch. "Right on time," the man said, his voice flat. He handed Jake the keys without ceremony. "No pets, no loud parties, and whatever you do, don't bother the neighbors. They keep to themselves." Jake nodded, already thinking about how he'd rearrange the sparse furniture. But then the landlord added, almost as an afterthought, "And don't open the door after midnight." "What?" Jake frowned. The landlord waved a hand dismissively. "It's just house rules. You'll be fine. Enjoy your new home." He hurried off, leaving Jake standing there with the keys in hand, his stomach doing a slow flip. The interior of the house smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour that he couldn't quite identify. But then Jake shrugged it off, chalking it up to the house being closed up for a while. The living room was sparsely furnished. A lumpy couch, a coffee table with one leg shorter than the others, and an old television perched on a rickety stand. The kitchen wasn't much better, with outdated appliances and a small table covered in a faded checkered cloth. But Jake wasn't one to complain. This was a step up from the crammed studio apartment he'd left behind. As he wandered through the house, he noticed small details that seemed off. The windows in the upstairs bedroom wouldn't open, no matter how hard he tugged. The bathroom mirror was warped, bending his reflection into a grotesque version of himself. But Jake told himself these were just quirks, the kind you'd find in any old house. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house seemed to come alive. The faint hum of the refrigerator sounded louder, almost like a low growl. The floorboards creaked in the hallway, but Jake was the only one there. He cooked a simple dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, and ate in the dimly lit kitchen. But as he sat there, he felt a strange sensation, as though he were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but then he shook his head. The house was empty. He was just tired. That night, he unpacked a few boxes, arranging his books on the rickety shelves and setting up his laptop on the kitchen table. By the time he crawled into bed, he felt a sense of accomplishment, as though he'd taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. But then, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard it, a faint knocking sound. Jake's eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the house. Knock, knock, knock. He sat up, straining to listen. The knocking seemed to be coming from the front door. Jake glanced at the clock, 12:03 a.m. He remembered the landlord's warning and felt a chill crawl down his spine. But then he reasoned it could just be a late-night prank or someone lost and looking for directions. The knocking grew more insistent, almost frantic. Knock, knock, knock. Jake swung his legs over the side of the bed, every instinct telling him to stay put, but curiosity tugged at him. He crept down the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. When he reached the bottom, he saw the outline of someone standing behind the frosted glass of the front door. "Who's there?" Jake called out, but then there was no answer. The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Jake's fingers hovered over the lock, tempted to turn it, but then he stepped back. Something didn't feel right. The whispers started then, soft and faint, like the rustling of leaves. But Jake couldn't make out any words. It was as though the house itself was murmuring, trying to tell him something. A cold draft swept through the hallway, and Jake shivered. He backed away from the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The silence returned, but then it was worse than the knocking. He felt trapped, unsure if he should ignore it or confront whatever was out there. Finally, Jake forced himself to return to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The shadows in the room seemed darker, thicker, and every little creak or groan of the house made him flinch. By morning, the house felt different, less menacing, more ordinary. Jake convinced himself it was just his nerves. But then, as he made his way to the kitchen for coffee, he noticed something chilling. There, on the inside of the front door, were 3 deep scratches, as if something had been trying to claw its way in. The next few days passed in a strange, monotonous rhythm for Jake. He tried to ignore the scratches on the front door, telling himself they were nothing, but every time he walked past the door, he glanced at them. He thought about covering them up, but then decided against it. It didn't seem worth the effort. Besides, he had other things to focus on: unpacking, settling in, and figuring out his next steps in life. During the day, the house seemed normal enough. The light streaming through the windows gave the place a tired but harmless charm. But then, as the sun started to sink behind the distant trees, a subtle shift would occur. The air inside the house would grow heavier, the shadows darker, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum would fill the silence. Jake noticed it on the second evening, but then tried to ignore it. He didn't want to seem paranoid. By the third evening, however, he couldn't ignore it anymore. The hum wasn't just in the air, it was in the walls. But then it would stop whenever he pressed his ear against them, as if the house was playing a cruel game. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to feel on edge. And when night fell, the feeling only worsened. That night, he tried to keep himself busy. He cleaned the kitchen again, though it was already spotless. He scrolled through his phone, but then his reception cut out. It happened once or twice before, but it always came back after a few minutes. This time, it didn't. Jake frowned and tossed the phone onto the couch. He didn't want to feel trapped, but also he didn't want to overthink things. It was probably just bad service. At around 11 p.m., Jake decided to call it a night. He wasn't particularly tired, but lying in bed seemed better than pacing the house. He turned off the lights, climbed under the covers, and stared at the ceiling. The house was silent. Too silent. But then, just as he was starting to drift off, the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. Jake's eyes snapped open. He sat up in bed, heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the clock, 11:58 p.m. It wasn't quite midnight yet, but it was close enough to send a shiver down his spine. He waited, hoping it would stop. But then the knocking came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Jake threw off the covers and crept down the stairs, his bare feet making no sound on the worn wood. He reached the bottom and peered through the peephole, but he saw nothing. He waited, holding his breath, but then he turned away, deciding not to open the door. He remembered the landlord's warning, strange as it was, and something deep inside him told him not to break the rule. The knocking stopped, but then a new sound began. Whispers. They were faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but then they grew louder, coming from every direction at once. Jake spun around, trying to locate the source, but it was impossible. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the endless, maddening whispers. Jake backed away, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but then, what else could explain this? He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. He thought about calling the landlord, but then he remembered his phone didn't have service. Frustrated and scared, he grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and began searching the house. He checked every room, opening closets and cabinets, but found nothing unusual. The whispers continued, but they seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jake ran his hand along the cold plaster, feeling for anything strange, but it felt solid. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. Then he remembered the attic. He hadn't spent much time up there since moving in, but now it seemed like the only place left to check. He grabbed the pull cord and yanked it down, unfolding the creaky ladder. The attic was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. Jake climbed up slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. At first, he saw nothing but old furniture and cardboard boxes. But then, in the far corner, something caught his eye. A small wooden chest, half hidden beneath a tattered blanket. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he expected to find, but then he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. Jake picked up the first one and examined it. It showed a family standing in front of the house, smiling at the camera. But something about their smiles seemed wrong, forced, unnatural. He flipped it over and saw a date scrawled in faded ink, October 1973. He picked up another photo. This one showed a woman standing alone in the living room. Her expression was blank, her eyes wide with fear. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but then he knew one thing. Something terrible had happened in this house. As he sorted through the photos, he found one that made his blood run cold. It showed the front door, the same door he had now, with deep scratches running across it. The photo was dated December 1973, just 2 months after the first one. Jake dropped the photo, his hands shaking. He didn't want to believe it, but then everything started to make sense. The landlord's warning, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. This house wasn't normal. It was dangerous. He wanted to leave, but it was the middle of the night, and he didn't know where he would go. He climbed down from the attic, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he didn't know who to trust. He thought about his friend, Mark, who had warned him about taking the place. Maybe he could help. But then he remembered his phone still didn't have service. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the living room. Jake ran down the hall, his flashlight beam darting around wildly. But when he reached the room, he found nothing out of place. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. He felt a growing sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. Then he saw it. The front door was wide open. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't remember unlocking it, and he was certain he had left it closed. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He stood there, paralyzed by fear, as a cold wind swept through the house. "Jake?" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was enough to snap him out of his trance. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but he saw nothing. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. He wasn't alone. He slammed the front door shut and locked it, his hands trembling. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He needed help, but he was cut off from the outside world. He felt trapped, isolated, and completely alone. As he stood there, trying to calm his racing heart, he noticed something on the floor. It was another photograph, but this one was different. It showed him, standing in the living room holding the flashlight, but the photo was old, yellowed with age, as if it had been taken decades ago. Jake stared at it in horror, his mind reeling. He didn't understand what was happening, but then he knew one thing. This wasn't just a house. It was something else, something far more sinister. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed into the living room, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to reverberate in his skull. The photograph of him, taken so many years ago, lay crumpled in his shaking hands. He glanced around the room again, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The house felt like it was closing in on him. The walls weren't just whispering now, they were screaming. He could feel the air grow colder, colder with each passing moment, as if the house was absorbing all the warmth from his body, leaving him numb and frozen. But he didn't dare move. He didn't dare blink. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was no way out. The front door was locked. He made sure of that. But when he glanced back at the door, The shadows around the edges seemed thicker, more distorted, as if the darkness itself was beginning to bleed through. He could hear something in the distance, a soft, steady thump. It was growing louder. Thump, thump, thump. Jake's pulse raced. The knocking had returned, only this time it wasn't just at the door. It was coming from everywhere. Thump, thump, thump. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything was vibrating with the sound, a maddening, rhythmic noise that drowned out his thoughts, leaving him in a state of pure panic. He grabbed his phone, desperate for some contact with the outside world. But once again, there was no signal, no escape. He staggered into the kitchen, his feet dragging like lead, his mind too consumed by terror to focus. The clock on the wall blinked 12, an ominous, mocking reminder that time had stopped. But the thumping, it wouldn't stop. He wanted to scream, to run, to throw himself through the nearest window, but he was paralyzed. Every part of him told him to leave, but every part of the house seemed to pull at him, keeping him tethered to this nightmare. In a daze, he moved back toward the hallway, where he had first heard the whispers, still echoing in his ears. But now they weren't whispers. They were words, clear and sharp, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You shouldn't have come." Jake spun around, his back pressed to the wall as if it could offer him some comfort. The darkness of the house swallowed the light from his flashlight, leaving only a sliver of visibility in the otherwise pitch-black corridor. The words had come from behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. His breath came out in ragged gasps. His mind fought to hold on, to remain rational, but then the floor shifted beneath his feet. A loud crack echoed in the silence, followed by another, and another. Then the entire floor buckled. Jake cried out as he stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. The floorboards split open with a loud gut-wrenching sound. He reached out, trying to steady himself, but the ground opened beneath him, pulling him downward. "No!" Jake screamed, grabbing at the edges of the floor, but his fingers couldn't find purchase. He was falling into the black abyss below. Then, before he could grasp what was happening, the ground collapsed entirely, and he tumbled through the void. The fall felt endless. The world spun in a dizzying blur of shadows, the walls stretching and warping, the air growing thick with the scent of earth and decay. And then, suddenly, he landed, hard. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, the force knocking the wind out of him. For a few moments, all Jake could do was lie there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the unease creeping up his spine. The floor beneath him was damp, uneven, the surface like soft soil. But it wasn't just the earth that unsettled him, it was the overwhelming coldness of it, and the strange, distant whispers that had followed him down here. Slowly he managed to sit up, his heart hammering in his chest. The space around him was dark, but there was an unnatural glow, faint and sickly, emanating from the walls. The room was like nothing he had ever seen, its architecture twisted and wrong. It was as if the house itself had decided to become something else, something far worse. And then he saw it. On the far wall was a door. Its frame was cracked and jagged, its surface covered in grime and mold. But more than that, it was the sound of the door that made Jake's blood run cold. A low hum emanated from it, like a lullaby, soft, soothing, and yet filled with an undercurrent of menace. Jake rose to his feet. His legs felt weak, unsteady, but there was something about that door that made him want to go to it. It called to him, softly, persistently. Something deep inside told him that this door was the answer, that it was the only way out. But then his instincts flared again. He didn't trust it. He couldn't trust it. He turned away, his mind screaming at him to leave, to turn around and find another escape. But as he did, a voice, deep, gravelly, and cold, whispered in his ear, "You cannot leave, Jake." Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was so close, it felt as if it had come from inside his skull. He spun around, expecting to see someone behind him, but there was no one. The room seemed to stretch and shrink at once, the walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Jake's heart began to race again, and his skin prickled with the raw, aching feeling of something deeply wrong. He didn't understand. He needed to understand. The door beckoned again, the hum more intense now, filling the air with its unsettling melody. But Jake couldn't move. It was as if the door had frozen him in place. His muscles refused to obey. He had to go to the door, but he couldn't. He took a step forward, then another, and finally he reached it. His hand touched the cool, damp surface of the door. The hum intensified, vibrating beneath his skin. But then he stopped. Something shifted. The door began to open on its own, slowly, as if the house itself was letting him in. His hand shot back, and the door creaked open wider. What he saw on the other side took his breath away. It wasn't another room. It was a reflection of the house above. It was the same layout, the same walls, the same kitchen and living room. But there was something wrong about it. The colors were inverted, the walls slightly distorted, as if the world on the other side was a twisted reflection of reality. The shadows were darker, the light harsher, and in the center of the room stood him. Jake's own reflection, but twisted. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with an expression of terror that mirrored his own. He reached out a hand, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared back, its lips curling into a smile that wasn't his. "No," Jake whispered, backing away, but the reflection inched closer, its smile widening, its eyes glinting with malice. "You're too late, Jake." The voice came from behind him and he spun around. There in the shadows stood the landlord. His eyes were hollow, his face gray and sunken, his body disjointed and unnatural. "It's always too late," the landlord murmured, his voice cracking. "You should have never opened that door, Nair. It wasn't meant for you." Jake turned back to the reflection, but it was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. The twisted version of himself reached out from the other side of the door, its hand coming through, its fingers icy cold. Before he could react, the hand gripped him by the throat, pulling him toward the door. The last thing Jake heard was the landlord's voice, one final whisper, "You were never meant to leave." And then, the door slammed shut. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling journey into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new horror story. And let us know in the comments, do you think Jake made the right choice by staying in the house? What would you have done in his place? Share your thoughts on what you say. The house might be listening.